Hey guys, welcome back. It's me, Bo, here on the Film Scene Investigation channel. I hope everyone is doing good. In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing the 1982 Michael Winner movie, Death Wish 2. So, Death Wish from 1982 was the sequel to the original Death Wish from 1974. The director from the first installment, Michael Winner, returned to the director's chair along with leading man Charles Bronson. Now, first and foremost, I am a huge fan of this film. I've seen it many times and it doesn't disappoint. In every sense, Death Wish 2 was a big improvement over the original, and it was also a box office success. I've seen all 5 of the Death Wish movies, and by far Death Wish 2 for me is the best in the series. While the later films became a little bit more silly and bombastic, the second installment featured the perfect blend of action and drama. The story followed Charles Bronson's character, Paul Kersey, now living in Los Angeles with his girlfriend, Jerry Nichols, played by actress Jill Ireland. By all accounts, it seemed like Paul was happy and content with his new life and was no longer haunted by the events from the first film. We saw Paul collect his daughter Carol from a psychiatric hospital where she'd been staying. Carol, played by actress Robin Sherwood, had been severely affected by the events from the first film and only now had started to show signs of recovery. This was 8 years after the original attack that happened in New York, yet Carol was still suffering the consequences. While visiting a local fairground with his daughter, Paul was targeted by a group of scumbags who stole his wallet in the process. The gang, which included a young Lawrence Fishburne, surrounded Paul and attacked him before he got a chance to defend himself. Showing no signs of fear, Paul decided to chase the group down in an attempt to retrieve his belongings. He ended up cornering one guy called Jiver, but was unable to get his wallet back. He was quite rightly upset about what happened, but Paul decided to take the high road and just forget about it, yet the thugs weren't finished with him. While searching through the stolen wallet, the gang discovered Paul's home address and decided to drive to his apartment. Once they arrived, they broke into Paul's home and began sexually assaulting the house cleaner, who was played by actress Sandra Gallardo. This assault just went on forever. It seemed like it never ended. And with the severity of the assault itself, there was no mistake that these 5 scumbags were utterly disturbed. They were a real group of sadistic individuals not fit to live in any society. Paul and Carol would eventually leave the fairground and return home, where they walked in on the assault taking place. Before Paul could get help or do anything, he was attacked by the group and knocked unconscious. Carol, the innocent bystander, was then kidnapped by the gang, hurled into a van and driven off to a warehouse. This would all lead to a scene later on where we saw Carol subjected to yet another sexual assault. This guy called Punk Cut, played by actor Lamont Johnson, was all over Carol as she just laid there, completely helpless. This was a very hard scene to sit through. Carol, she wasn't screaming, she wasn't fighting back, she was just laying there, taking the abuse. We then saw Carol attempt to escape and ended up running out of a window. She ended up impaling herself on some rails outside in a very horrific death. This was a shocking moment that I didn't see coming at all. It all happened so fast. I mean, one minute Carol was just lying there, almost in a comatose state. The next, she was running out of a window and then she was dead. Picking apart the sequence of events, it was clear that the assault pushed Carol over the edge and made her commit suicide. She was psychologically unstable, and now having been attacked again, it was, all too much for her to handle. Carol didn't realise what she was doing. The only thing that she knew was that she couldn't just sit there and wait for another scumbag to come and attack her. She had to escape, and she didn't care how she did it, whether it be through a door or out of a window. Paul Kersey would later find out about what happened to Carol and assumed that the gang had thrown her out of the building. In his eyes, the gang had not only kidnapped his daughter, but they had killed her as well. This was another tragic blow for Paul Kersey, who eventually returned to his old ways and began hunting down the scumbags one by one. Unlike the original Death Wish, this time around, Paul knew who the attackers were. He had seen their faces before, so this time around, Kersey was able to get revenge on the exact people responsible. In the 1974 original, Paul reacted to those events by randomly attacking any street trash that got in his way. While it was good to see Paul Kersey take out the New York street trash, this time around I did prefer seeing Kersey, get revenge on the actual culprits. With Death Wish 2, things were a lot more calculated. Paul had a plan. He knew what he was going to do and had zero remorse for those responsible. After Carol's funeral, Paul returned to work, keeping up appearances and pretended that he was okay. People were rallying around him, trying to support him, but Paul was putting on this brave face to fool everyone. Paul actually started living a double life, prowling the degenerate LA streets, mixing with the likes of junkies and prostitutes, all in the attempt to track down the gang that kidnapped his daughter. His work, his relationship with Jerry, it all became secondary, with his main focus on getting revenge. So the remainder of the movie saw Paul Kersey hunt down and kill the various street thugs responsible. Once Paul had returned to his vigilante ways, the film really did kick into high gear. Kersey began dealing out the street justice that the courts could never deliver. There's one scene in particular that I love where we saw Kersey follow one of the gang members into an abandoned hotel building. The thug, played by actor Kevin Howard, was dealing drugs when suddenly Paul Kersey came out from the darkness with his gun pointed towards him. There was this memorable line from Kersey about how the thug was about to meet Jesus before he shot him dead. It was a great scene, and it really showcased Paul Kersey's no-nonsense attitude. He wasn't messing around. He meant business and was going to do everything he could to take out all of the gang members. The look and feel of Death Wish 2 was another brilliant aspect of the movie that I wanted to mention. The cinematography was top quality, especially the nighttime sequences of Paul Kersey prowling the streets of downtown Los Angeles. There was a mood, there was an atmosphere that was created. The dark underbelly of society shown in all its glory. Death Wish 2 definitely looked the part, with the later sequels looking rather cheap in comparison. One key factor that helped create the film's dark and violent aesthetic was the amazing soundtrack from musician Jimmy Page. The legendary guitarist from Led Zeppelin contributed several tracks to the film, and I must say, the material was fantastic. It's one of my favourite soundtracks of all time, and it definitely left its mark. The unique soundscape that Jimmy Page created blended perfectly with the dark and brooding imagery that was on screen. At times, the music almost was like another character within the story. It was that powerful. It was an intriguing and compelling effort by Jimmy Page, who sadly didn't go on to produce any further film scores. And so, dislikes for Death Wish 2 from 1982. My biggest dislike for this movie would have to be the prolonged sex sequence that took place in Paul's apartment. So, as I've already mentioned, early in the film we saw the cleaner, Rosario, get brutally assaulted by the gang. Now, I've never been that comfortable watching these types of sequences. Most of the time they're overtly sexualized and really add nothing to the narrative. When it comes to this specific scene in Death Wish 2, I understood the context it had with the story, but I did find the execution very distasteful and kind of mean-spirited. There was no legitimate reason for the director, Michael Winner, to include such a prolonged sequence of sexual torture. Yes, we understand, we get it. These guys are scumbags and they need to be stopped. But yeah, I don't know, the sequence just didn't need to drag on for so long. It almost felt like Winner was purposely pushing the boundaries to see what he could get away with. Now, in fairness, it could be argued that the director was attempting to almost dehumanize the group so that when they were eventually killed by Paul Kersey, the audience felt no sympathy for them. But I don't know, it just seemed a little too absurd for my liking. And with the heavy sexual brutality on show, it caused mass censorship when the film was released, causing hysteria in the media. Journalists were having a field day, shaming the film for its harsh depictions of on-screen violence. And while the film did capitalize on the controversy, no doubt it cheapened its overall reputation with audiences who believed that Death Wish 2 was pure and simply just exploitation. In actuality, this movie holds a lot more substance than people might think it does. But yeah, the reputation of Death Wish 2 was definitely tarnished. Another dislike I want to quickly mention was the lack of screen time between the characters Paul Kersey and Lieutenant Ochoa. So, throughout the film, Ochoa, played by actor Vincent Gardena, was tasked to track down Kersey and, prevent further bloodshed. It was this cat and mouse game, if you will, with the detective always a few steps behind Paul Kersey. The two characters would eventually meet, but only for a very brief moment before Ochoa died of a gunshot wound. Now, in terms of the context to the story, it made sense and it was a well executed scene. I just wish that the characters had a more prolonged scene together, because ultimately the two actors had a very good on-screen chemistry. In the original Death Wish, the two characters had a lot more scenes together, and I really liked their back and forth discussions, but sadly for the sequel, that was sadly missing. And so, ratings for Death Wish 2. I'm going to be rating this movie a solid 8 out of 10. When it comes to sequels, Death Wish 2 really did outshine the original 1974 cult classic. It had a better story, there was more action, and a brilliant soundtrack by Jimmy Page. You know, I think some credit has to go to the director Michael Winner, who came back and delivered a vastly improved follow-up to his original work. Sequels don't always live up to the original. I mean, there's been a lot of bad sequels over the years, but in this instance, I thought Winner produced a superior installment, the best of the franchise. While the acting performances were nothing special, this was a thoroughly enjoyable 90 minutes of gritty 80s action. The film maintained this steady and engaging pace, and at no time was I bored. When it comes to recommendations, I absolutely recommend Death Wish 2, but my advice for anyone out there who hasn't seen it yet would be to watch the original 1974 version and then watch Death Wish 2. Two films back to back make a brilliant double feature. For those who have seen Death Wish 2, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. And well, that's all from me today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed the review. I'll be back next week with some more content. Don't forget to subscribe, and of course, take care.